back to On the Fly. We're previewing the predicting and recapping World Junior Championships, our Men's World Championships, the Women's World Championship, the U18 Men's World Championship. Expect the unexpected.
Absolute abomination of the Canadian Junior National Team.
I have a couple extra words I want to use on that one. And it's Freebird. Freebird, Freebird, Freebird. Of course, the Olympics are just around the corner. I'm going to coin it the rivalry day.
World Junior Hockey!
Your home for international hockey. This is On the Fly. Hello everyone and welcome back to On the Fly, your home for international hockey. I'm your host Parker McLean and you're listening to episode number 2 of the On the Fly International Hockey Podcast. Today we're going to be diving into the lower division tournaments, looking at just how competitive international hockey has gotten and answering your live questions towards the end of the program. Thank you all for being here on this beautiful Sunday afternoon, depending on where you're watching from. Be sure to smash that like button, hit the subscribe button to join our community. If you're catching us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. You can also find us on Instagram, X, and TikTok at OnTheFly1515. But with that, we'll hop into it today, starting with our first topic of the day, and one that we did touch a little bit on last week, which was the Women's World Championships Division 3A tournament, which obviously a lower division tournament, one that is you're looking to have both the relegation and the promotion side from February 21st to March 1st, so wrapped up right around their last podcast date. That was actually on that day exactly, happening in Zagreb, Croatia. And so we'll hop into it today, starting with some of the scores from that tournament. And we'll start here on day number 1. We'll see Turkey taking on Serbia. Turkey to take that one 4-2. It was a pretty close game between these two teams. The slight edge did go to Turkey in this one, but you saw it throughout, back and forth all the way through, and fortunately for Turkey in that one, able to take home the victory, 4-2 win at that. Romania taking on Bulgaria, a 5-1 win for Romania in that one. This one was a complete domination fest, with Romania taking it, outshooting Bulgaria 49-13 and winning on the scoreboard 5-1 the final. One of those blowout type games that we were kind of expecting in that one, I'd say. Then Thailand and Croatia, a 2-1 win for Thailand. And then it was more that kind of comeback desperation fashion, where for Thailand, they were able to get those 2 goals late in the frame and really kind of upset Croatia in a way. I wouldn't say that game was much of an upset, but it was more so the way that it ended up playing out was where we kind of saw a little bit more of that upset type factor. 2-1 win for Thailand on the opening day, a big win for them as they look forward into the rest of the tournament. February the 24th brought another 3 games on the slate. Romania taking on Turkey, a big win by Turkey, 4-3 the final in that one. And we sort of saw it towards the end with Romania kind of getting that desperation factor into the third period. Got the 3-2, 3-3 goal to tie the game, but unfortunately just not enough as Turkey were able to get that last goal and take home the win, a 4-3 victory at that. Then to the second game of the day, Serbia winning 4-3 in a shootout over Thailand. This game was a domination game by Thailand, but unfortunately just couldn't quite get the job done. A 12-round shootout decided this one before Serbia ended up getting the winner and taking it 4-3 your final in a shootout. Then the third game of the day between Croatia and Bulgaria, a 2-1 shootout win again for Croatia over Bulgaria, 2-1. This was another game that was kind of a domination factor as well, and it was a 50-15 shot total for those who like to enjoy their shot total as far as comparison factor. But this game was all Croatian. Bulgaria weren't able to get much going, kind of accepting the fact that they were going to play defensive through most of this game. Unfortunately, weren't able to pull out the win, but they did pick up a point, knocking off stealing a point from Croatia as they did take it 2-1 in the shootout. Then to the third game of the day on February the 26th, Thailand beat Bulgaria 7-4, another domination type game by Thailand, outshooting Bulgaria 49-23. It was another one of those games, I'd say, that was a bit more that expected result, and Thailand able to finally kind of generate some of that offense we hadn't seen throughout the rest of the tournament. Good to see them get going, a 7-4 win in this one. Second game of the day between Romania and Serbia, a 3-2 shootout win for Romania, a big 2 points in the standings. And this was one that was another one of those coin flip type games. It obviously ends up getting decided in the shootout, but one of those games that very much could have gone either way. Romania does end up taking it 3-2 in the shootout. Then the last game of the day between Croatia and Turkey. Croatia did win that one 6-0. This was a game of special teams. 5 of the 6 goals in this one ended up being a special teams goal, whether it be power play or shorthanded. And so it was one of those games that I'm sure Turkey would have wanted back, but unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get the job done. Croatia does pick up the big 3 points in the standings with the 6-0 win. Then we go to day 2, and the day 2 part, once again, February the 27th, Romania takes on Thailand, and this one was another one of those coin flip type games. Romania got into the lead late into this game towards the end of that third period and were able to hold on long enough to take it 2-0 the final for Romania over Thailand, which ended up being a huge 3 points in the standings. Then to the second game between Turkey and Bulgaria, a 4-1 win for Turkey over Bulgaria. This one was somewhat tight, but you kind of knew throughout that Turkey was going to end up walking away with this one. 4-1 win for them. Then to the third game of the day between Croatia and Serbia, a 5-3 win for Croatia over the Serbs. And this was a game that I'd say was another one of those kind of tighter games. You also add in the fact that, of course, the Croatia did end up scoring the empty net as well. So a very tight game in this one between these two teams, and a huge win for Croatia, picking up a huge 3 points in the standings, really guaranteeing them out of that relegation spot. You always want to end up the higher you can in the standings, and so a big 3 points for them, not having to worry about being the potential of being relegated. Then on to the last day of games, Thailand taking on Turkey, a 3-2 win for Thailand in this one. This was a back and forth type game. Thailand did outshoot Turkey 35-20, but still it was one of those games that, once again, Thailand struggling to score all tournament long, and it continues to bite them in the butt in this one. Fortunately for them, though, they do walk out with the victory, which then set up the final day. They were in the top spot after this game for the potential of being promoted. They needed, I believe it would have been a Romania overtime win, or a Croatia overtime win. Basically, they needed overtime in that game. They didn't quite get it, but Bulgaria taking on Serbia, 3-2 overtime win for Bulgaria. This one was one of those games that I'd say Bulgaria, we saw them definitely take control of the play more than anything else in this game. 50-36 the shots for Bulgaria. Then into the overtime frame is where we really saw them kind of take control, out shooting Serbia 9-2. The far better chances, the far better quality chances too. They end up taking this one 3-2 in overtime, the final. Then to the last game of the day between Romania and Croatia. Romania did take this one 5-2, your final. They led 4-0 going into the third period. Then we saw Croatia have kind of that comeback. They put 2 goals up on the board before Romania able to get that last goal. And so this was another game that, once again, huge implications. The winner very likely would have ended up going on to be that promoted spot. So it's kind of that winner-take-all type mentality for Croatia. Unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get it going. Romania able to jump out to that early lead and hold on to it. They end up taking it 5-2 and taking a big 3 points, which ends up bringing us over to the standings. And for our final standings, we have Romania in the top spot, who will be promoted to the Division 2B tournament with 11 points. Thailand in second place with 10 points. Turkey in the third spot with 9 points. Croatia in the fourth spot with 8. Serbia in the fifth spot with 4 points, and Bulgaria in the last spot, who'll be relegated to Division 3B for next year's tournament with 3 points. A bit of a disappointing tournament for them. They were kind of sniffing around it at times, but unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite find that last opportunity to get them on the board. So a disappointing tournament for them. They do end up in the relegated spot, which brings us over to our current Women's World Championship rankings. You can ignore the Division 3B tournament, as that we'll talk about that in just a second here. But Romania in the promoted spot with 35th spot, 36th for Thailand, 37th for Turkey, 38th for Croatia, 39th for Serbia, and in the 40th spot for Bulgaria, who will be sent down to next year's tournament in the relegated spot. That will do it for our Women's World Championship Division 3A coverage for today. We will now shift over to, of course, the second topic of today with the Women's World Championship Division 3B tournament. And this was another tournament that has been going on for the last week or so in Kohtla-Järve, Estonia, February the 28th to March the 6th. We'll start here on the opening day of action between Bosnia and the Philippines. A 6-4 win for Bosnia in this one. This was a game that I'd say was definitely more dominated by the Philippines, and the story of sort of those Asian countries struggling to score goals continues into this game. And yes, they're able to put up 4 goals, but when you outshoot a team 42-28, it's very difficult to walk away with a loss, and the Philippines did end up doing that in this game. Bosnia hopped out to the early lead, held on to their lead long enough. Unfortunately, the Philippines just couldn't quite get themselves back into this game. A bit of a tough one there for them. They do walk away. Bosnia does walk away with a 6-4 win. A huge early 3 points in the standings. Then to the second game of the day between Estonia and South Africa. Estonia did walk away with a 7-0 blowout victory in this one. Wasn't much of a competitive game at all. And really, Estonia walked all over the South Africans in this game. A bit of a disappointing one there for sure. Then to the third game of the day between Israel and Singapore. Israel did walk away with the 11-0 victory in this one. Blowout type game. I mean, you look at an 11-0 score line. There's not much value to really talk about in this game. It was a blowout game from start to finish. Israel walks away with a huge 11-0 win. Then on to March the 1st, where South Africa took on Bosnia. Bosnia did end up taking this one 3-2 the final. This was a pretty defensive game between these two teams. For Bosnia, obviously trying to kind of quell the South African push. We didn't see a lot of the offense in their first game against Estonia, but it was still one of those games for Bosnia that they struggled to get a lot going. You know, shot totals 22-20 for South Africa in the lead, but really for this Bosnian team, it was going to be a tight one, especially with the way that they play, and we saw it earlier in the game against the Philippines. Not necessarily going to be pushing the pace terribly offensively, but more so committing to a defensive structure and transitioning up the ice into their offensive push. 3-2 the final for Bosnia in their opener. Then Estonia versus Israel. A 4-1 win for Estonia over the Israelis. A huge win for them. 43-23 were the shots for Estonia, but this game was a tight game. And it was a 2-1 game going into the final few minutes of the third. Israel pulls their goaltender, gets scored on twice with the empty net. And so this was a game for Estonia that was sort of that tone setter for the rest of the tournament. They knew coming in that if they could get to this point, they would be okay going forward. A huge win for them, picking up a big 3 points in the standings, which ultimately helped them quite a bit down the line as they looked forward through the rest of this tournament. Then to the last game of the day between the Philippines and Singapore, an 8-0 win for the Philippines over Singapore in this one. Another blowout type game, not too much to talk about there, an 8-0 one at that, which then brings us on to day number 2. Or I guess day number 3, 4, and 5 with March the 3rd, where we'll see South Africa beating Singapore 5-1. This game was an absolute slaughterfest for the South Africans. 54-5 the shots, and of course 5-1 in the score sheet. But it was also 3-1 with 3 minutes left, and so for Singapore, they kind of held on, and that's been the storyline for most of this tournament for this Singapore team, is more or less hold on for as long as you can. If you can get a couple chances here or there, that's where they can really cause some havoc. A really well-played game in this one by Singapore. Unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get that next chance up to turn the tide in this one. We also saw a 1-1 going into the third period in this game. Definitely a tighter one, to say the least. Then to the second game of the day between Israel and the Philippines. This was another game for the Philippines where out shooting their opponents with a lot of chances. Unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get that finishing chance to put them over the edge. They did lose 3-1 to the Israeli team for the final. Big 3 points for Israel as they continue to look forward into the standings. Then the big game, and this was sort of the game that we talked about last week, about whether or not for Estonia, for Bosnia, which team was going to end up on top of the group and end up being promoted to the Division 3A tournament. This game had a lot of implications, as well as the Israeli-Bosnia game from March the 1st. But this game between Estonia and Bosnia, we end up finding out, is the deciding factor in this grand scheme of the tournament. And so for the Estonian team, a 3-1 win. You look at this game, Bosnia sort of dominated the shots. I mean, it was 26-24, but this was a game by far that Estonia jumps out to the early lead, right? And we see it from time to time, especially with some of these European-type teams, where you jump out to the early lead and then you sit on it. And for Estonia, jumped out to the early 3-0 lead. And you sit on that lead, you know that you don't necessarily need to win this game by a large margin. It's all about winning the game. And so for the Estonians, they end up pulling through in this game. They sit on their lead. Yes, you see Bosnia kind of pull into that desperation type factor. But in the end, you knew that as soon as Estonia went up 3-0 in this game, they weren't going to choke that lead away. A huge win for them in that Division 3B tournament, and one of the main reasons why they end up getting promoted with two relatively easier teams left to go in this one. Then we go to March the 4th. Philippines taking on South Africa. This was another game I'd say that was a bit more of that kind of tighter type game. And for South Africa, you look at it, 22-18 in shots for South Africa. You also look at the fact that they weren't able to score in this game. And that was one of the biggest differentiating factors. Was for the Philippines, they got their goals. The South Africans did get a shorthanded goal late to bring it within one, but this game was over. And it wasn't necessarily one of those games that you thought the South Africans were going to be able to come back in. Yes, they were able to keep up in terms of pace with the Philippines, but not necessarily a tight enough game that you really would expect it to be all that close. Then to the second game of the day between Bosnia and Israel, a huge game for kind of that second place spot in the grand scheme of this tournament. Not likely either team was going to catch Estonia, especially when they played Singapore and the Philippines to close out the tournament. But more so to set the tone for next year's tournament. For Bosnia, a 4-3 win in this one, outshooting Israel 35-16. We saw a little bit of a comeback in that third period, and so a pretty big game there for Bosnia and for Israel. And we saw that kind of desperation factor kick in. A huge win for Bosnia, setting the tone for next year's tournament, which then brings us on to the last game of the day for March the 4th, with Estonia beating Singapore 14-1, blowout type game. Not too much to talk about here. You look at it, one of those games that frankly is a 14-0 game. It's very hard to kind of talk much more, or 14-1 game rather, much harder to talk about that one much more. But we'll shift over now to March the 6th, the final day of action at this tournament. Bosnia did beat Singapore 11-0. Another one of those blowout type games, not too much more to add there. Then to the second game of the day between South Africa and Israel, a 3-1 win for South Africa over Israel, which was a huge win for them, and one that I'd say you look at it kind of looking back on the tournament for Israel. They had every opportunity in this tournament to make their way up. They had a 1-goal game against Bosnia. They were, I'd say, relatively tight with Estonia. They end up losing to South Africa. And so a bit of that disappointing type factor, I'd say, for this Israeli team. End up losing to South Africa in the final game, a 3-1 loss at that. You saw the late push towards the end for the Israelis, 12-4 in shots towards the end of that third period, but in the end, a little bit too little too late for the Israeli team, losing 3-1 to South Africa in this game, which then sets us up for the final game of the day between Estonia and the Philippines. And this game was not a pretty one, right? And a 9-0 win for Estonia over the Philippines in this one. One of those type games that I wouldn't say that they were terribly happy with, but obviously when you get blown out, it's never a fun one. A big final game for the Estonians to lock up their promotional spot. 9-0 win in that game, which brings us over to the final standings. And in our final standings, we will see Estonia, of course, in the top spot, the promoted spot to the Division 3A tournament for next year with 15 points. Bosnia in second place with 12 points. South Africa in third place with 6. Israel in fourth with 6. Philippines in fifth with 6. And then Singapore in the last spot. Remind that there's no relegation for the Division 3B tournament in that last spot with 0 points. And so an unfortunate end of the tournament for Singapore, who I wouldn't say necessarily were expecting to go all that far, but still definitely a disappointing one at that. But that will do it for our Division 3B Women's World Championship coverage. We'll now shift it over to the next topic. Topic number 3, with the men's U18 Division 3A tournament. And so this one, once again, it was more that kind of competitive type factor tournament, I'd say. Obviously, the higher up in terms of divisions you go, the more competitive it gets. And so the U18 men's Division 3A, Hong Kong, China, the host Hong Kong are actually in this tournament, March 2nd to March 8th. So it did conclude earlier this morning, which is why we've pushed the scheduled podcast time for this one. But we will hop into it today, starting with, of course, the scores from the opening, or the date, or March the 2nd we'll start with. Where we'll see first Israel taking on Bulgaria, a 9-5 win for Israel over Bulgaria in this one. This was about as back and forth as you can get. The shot totals dominated by the Israelis, but you watch this game and it is one of those games that very much could have went either way, and especially with the level of offense we saw in this game, it was an impressive type game. And I'd say for Israel, a huge win for them, right? And you set the tone through the rest of the tournament. For Bulgaria, a good effort, I'd say, more or less, just to kind of get themselves back on track. But a huge win for Israel, pick up the opening 3 points in the tournament, 9-5 win. Then to the second game between Turkey and New Zealand, a 10-2 win for Turkey in this one over New Zealand. And this was a pretty brutal game for Turkey, blowing out New Zealand in a really bad way. Not too much more to talk about there. You know, the blowout type game. Turkey ends up taking it 10-2 your final. Then to the third game of the day between Uzbekistan and Hong Kong. 6-2 win for Uzbekistan in this one. A big 3 points early on in the standings, especially against one of the better Hong Kong teams. Also adding the fact that, of course, they're playing on home ice, but this was one of those games that very much could have went either way. You look at it, yes, right, and it's one of those kind of competitive type games, I'd say. You can look at the shots, where of course 37-34 for Uzbekistan, but this was one of those games that, yes, the final score ends 6-2, but it very much could have went either way, which then brings us on to March the 3rd. And on March the 3rd, we see Israel beating Turkey 6-5 the final. This was a game that, yes, it was kind of dominated by Israel, but a huge 4-1 comeback in this game. We see Israel end up taking it 6-5 your final for the Israelis over Turkey. Tough game to lose for Turkey, but one still quite the game, and a big 3 points for Israel, as they have two pretty high scoring games to open the tournament. More on that in just a little bit. And then the last two games of the day, Uzbekistan taking on New Zealand, 13-2 win for Uzbekistan over New Zealand, blowout type game. Other game, Hong Kong beating Bulgaria 11-0. Another one of those blowout type games, not too much more to add there, which then brings us over to March the 5th. And on March the 5th, we see Bulgaria taking on New Zealand, a pretty blowout-ish type game. Yes, the score remained tight, but you look at this one, for Bulgaria, outshooting New Zealand 54-23. And it really was one of those games, I'd say, that was more on that blowout type side. Not necessarily kind of, I wouldn't say a close game, but you look at the pace of play, Bulgaria definitely leading it. And unfortunately for New Zealand, just couldn't quite hang on in this one. Bulgaria ends up taking it 5-3 your final. And then comes probably one of the more crazy games of this tournament. Uzbekistan taking on Turkey, a 7-6 win for Uzbekistan over Turkey in this one in overtime. And yes, right, you kind of see Turkey, if you look at the very end of this game, you can say, well, look, Uzbekistan ends up taking this game over Turkey 7-6. Got lucky, you know, the shots 45-36 for Turkey, in favor of Turkey. But you actually watch this game and it tells a little bit of a different story. And, it's a 6-3 lead for Uzbekistan kind of halfway towards the end of that third period in the game. And all of a sudden, Turkey comes storming back, gets themselves within a goal, and then Turkey, go empty net, shorthanded. They take a penalty. All of a sudden, they have to go back into their own end. They shift it back up ice on the rush, and sure enough, they tie the game with seconds left on the clock, forcing overtime against arguably the best team at this tournament, which we ultimately found out they were, which then all of a sudden brings us on to, of course, the end result. And unfortunately for Turkey, all the heroics just couldn't quite find their way back. The 6-second miracle to tie the game, force overtime, ends for nothing. 7-6 win for Uzbekistan in overtime over Turkey. A real tough loss for the Turks there, but in the end, Uzbekistan walks away with a big 2 points in this game, able to end up taking this one 7-6 in overtime. Then to the third game, or the third game of the day rather, with Hong Kong taking on Israel. A 6-4 win for Hong Kong in this one. This was a tough loss for Israel, and yes, another game that they ended up scoring a lot of goals, and they also gave up a lot of goals, and that's kind of the storyline of this tournament for them. Hong Kong gets out to a high margin lead, a 6-1 lead. Then we saw a little bit more of that desperation type factor. Kind of a minute in, Hong Kong gets that 6th goal. And then it's kind of that desperation time. And credit to Israel, they find their way back and they force it, get a couple goals in there. But unfortunately, just a little bit too little, too late yet again. They don't end up pulling through in this game. Tough loss for them, losing 6-4 to Hong Kong. And that'll do it for our first 3 days of action. Then on to the last two, starting on March the 6th, with Uzbekistan taking on Bulgaria. A 5-3 win for Uzbekistan in this one. And it was a bit more of that back and forth type game. But in the end, you knew from start to finish that Uzbekistan was going to end up on top in this one. A big 5-3 win, outshooting Bulgaria 41-15. And this was one of those games, I'd say that as much as, yes, the game kind of ended up close on the scoreboard, it wasn't necessarily as close as you would have anticipated. It could have went either way, yes, and Bulgaria had their chances and had some pretty good looks in this game, but unfortunately for them, just couldn't quite get the job done, losing to Uzbekistan 5-3 the final. Then to the second game of the day between Israel and New Zealand, an 8-1 blowout win for the Israelis in this one. Not much to talk about in that game. One of those more blowout type games from start to finish. Then to the third game of the day between Hong Kong and Turkey. This was more of that game that could have went either way yet again. And yes, you look at the final score, an 8-4, kind of blowout-ish on the scoreboard type victory. But this was a much tighter game than what the scoreboard kind of dictates. 47-39 in the shots, led by Hong Kong. But one of those games that could have very well went either way. And so, yes, in the end, Hong Kong ends up on top, but definitely a competitive game for the Turks in this one. An 8-4 win for Hong Kong in this game. Then to the last day of action, and actually today's action, as of the time of recording this podcast, on March the 8th, Uzbekistan taking on Israel, a 6-3 win for Uzbekistan over Israel. This was a really tight game, and we sort of saw a little bit of that pushback factor, and we talk a lot about resilience in these videos or in these podcasts, and one of the big factors we saw in this game is every time Israel scored a goal or, got a chance, we saw Uzbekistan kind of reshift the momentum in this game. And so, yes, Israel led the shot total. Yes, Israel continued their kind of forward push. But you watch this game and we saw the momentum continue to swing back into Uzbekistan's favor, and that's what you want to see, especially from these lower division type teams, is what happens when you do face a little bit of that resiliency factor, because as you continue to move up in the rankings, we will continue to see these teams kind of face better opponents, and you're going to end up down in these games, and it's about how you respond to that pressure. I thought Uzbekistan did a great job today at that, winning 6-3 the final. Big 3 points. They did solidify their spot as the promoted team at this year's tournament. More on that in just a second. Then to the second game of the day between Turkey and Bulgaria. A 4-2 win for Turkey in this one. Shots are 42-34 in favor of the Turks. But this game was, once again, another one of those games that we talked about a little bit a few minutes ago with the first game of the day between Uzbekistan and Israel. This was a very similar game where, of course, we did end up seeing Turkey go up early in this game, a 2-0 lead. Then Bulgaria rallies back, tying the game. Then we saw Turkey kind of establish themselves as the dominant factor in this game, ending up taking it 4-2 the final. More that competitive type matchup, I'd say, more than anything else. But still, a huge win for Turkey today. They do end up solidifying themselves in that fourth spot in the tournament. And so a bit more of that kind of momentum building game, not just for this year, but for next year's tournament as well. And then to the last game of the day between Hong Kong and New Zealand, in a bit of a meaningless game, and one that, yes, you obviously want to win every game you play. But for New Zealand, already locked into the relegation spot with their loss to Bulgaria. They couldn't move up with the tiebreaker. For Hong Kong, couldn't get any higher, couldn't get any lower in their group. Already locked into that second spot in the group. And so for this game, yes, we see Hong Kong end up taking it 6-0 in blowout fashion, but a bit of that game that doesn't mean all that much for them. And so unfortunately, not too much to kind of add there as far as the blowout factor, 6-0 final. A Hong Kong team who's been a dominant force at this tournament against New Zealand, who has been a bit of the punching bag, as we will now shift over to the final standings of this tournament, where we will, of course, see Uzbekistan going to who will be promoted into the Division 2B tournament for next year with 14 points in that top spot at this year's tournament. Hong Kong in the second spot with 12 points, Israel in third with 9, Turkey in fourth place with 7, Bulgaria in the fifth spot with 3 points, and then lastly with New Zealand with 0 points at this year's tournament. They will be relegated to the Division 3B tournament for next year. And so it's been a bit of a ride to get here, but we'll now shift to our updated final rankings for the men's U18 tournament. We've already gone through the Division 3B tournament, which happened earlier, about a week ago. We concluded that tournament, happened during the Olympic break. And so we look at this as far as the promoted team going up next year. Uzbekistan in the 35th spot, 36th for Hong Kong, 37th for Israel, 38th for Turkey, Bulgaria in the 39th spot, New Zealand, who will be relegated to the Division 3B tournament next year, in the 40th spot. 41st will be Thailand. They will be promoted up to the Division 3A level for next year. Iceland in 42, Bosnia in 43, Turkmenistan in 44th, South Africa in 45th, and Luxembourg in 46th spot. And so once again, congrats to Uzbekistan on being promoted up to next year's Division 2B tournament, a big accomplishment for them. Which then will shift us over to our next topic of the day as we shift away from the lower division tournaments and into a little bit more of the competitive realm. And so we look at it across the board, and of course the addition of the PWHL has been a huge addition for the international game, giving the women's side a chance to have best on best throughout the year, and with it has brought kind of a rising competitive factor. I think you look at it, especially at the last few Women's World Championships. You can look at it, especially at the most recent Women's Olympic tournament. It has been a growing game. And I think in many ways, as much as, yes, we haven't seen any of those kind of big upsets since 2019, where, of course, Finland nearly upset both Canada, or they ended up upsetting Canada, and nearly upset the U.S. in their game, in that gold medal game. We nearly saw a double upset there, but we haven't really seen anything since then. Yes, there's been some close run-ins. You think to the most recent Olympics, where Switzerland nearly beat Canada, 2-1 loss there. And then, of course, the U.S. against the Czechs, and the most recent Women's World Championship, where another 2-1 win there, but unfortunately just couldn't quite get that job done. And so the addition of the PWHL, I think, is a huge opportunity to continue to grow that game. And we've seen that addition really sort of shape, I'd say, more than anything else, that competitive atmosphere inside the women's international tournaments. And there's no better way to look at it than, well, you have some growing numbers. And especially on that kind of international side, I think you look to that March 31st deadline, which is quickly approaching, as a potential outlook as to, well, what's going to be reshaping, the international sphere. We're going to see more European players migrate over to North America to play in the PWHL. It's a huge opportunity to continue to grow the game, not only in the fanship, but also in the skill and the development of these players. And it's a huge opportunity. You look at right now, and I'd say it is still pretty North American dominant, obviously with Canada still leading the charge at 45.6%, the US with 41.5%. So that's basically 85% of the league tied up in the North American space, which then leaves kind of that 15-ish percent if we're looking at percentages for the rest. As far as the NHL comparison would go, 41% for Canada in the NHL, 28% for the US. So kind of add up those percentages roughly, that's about 70%, 30% of European players. But what we've seen is kind of as this league expands, yes, there's going to be a lot of North American players that will continue to kind of shape out the league and play a lot more of those depth type roles. But I do think that we're going to see, especially with the star talent that we've seen from other leagues like the Czechs, like the Swedes, like the Finns, like the Swiss, and of course the Russians too, which aren't a part of the international IIHF as of this current moment. But we will continue to see them continue to shape out the rest of these tournaments. So I think as much as right now, yes, your closest PWHL European nation is at 4.1%. There is still a lot of ways to go, and you're going to have an influx of European players coming over before the roster freeze with the SDHL, which is the Swedish league, Swedish Women's League, kind of coming to a close out over in Europe. They're going to end up having some of those players come over for the PWHL playoffs, which is just another opportunity to get more European players and grow the talent pool in Europe, so that when you do end up getting to the international sphere, the players are that much better. And we've seen that kind of trend, especially from that star talent, and we see it a lot with the Czech team, where the best players on the Czechs all come from the PWHL. And so it's a huge opportunity, I'd say more than anything else, to get more players in the door, with this SDHL's Game 5 of their finals being on March 31st. We'll see how many players end up coming over from that league. I think you kind of look around, and there's a few players that we've become very accustomed to on the international stage who very well can end up in that spot, and it really wouldn't surprise me to see them there. Nadia Mativi from Finland, or from Italy rather, the defenseman who logged a lot of minutes at the most recent Olympic Games, and I'd say for her, she's kind of that workhorse type defender. Very likely, I'd say she will end up coming overseas to the PWHL. A lot of opportunity there, kind of that middle six type defender, I'd say, on a lot of teams, but very skilled, very good puck moving defender, but can also lock it down defensively. The kind of defender you want going into a playoff run, especially for teams around the league that, frankly, it's hard to come by, right? And we'll see whether or not there's any movement there. Obviously, these are just some players that I'd say have the potential to kind of come over and shift into that kind of PWHL type role. Dominika Laskova from Czechia, another defender, plays both kind of offensive and defensive style, more of that shutdown defender as well. Kind of looking for that bottom six, I'd say, type role as far as defensive pairings go. Emma Nuutinen from Finland, forward, kind of probably more that middle six type role on a lot of the PWHL teams. A pretty good player overall, but one that I'd say very likely to end up shaping into that bottom six, middle six type role. You're probably looking at third line minutes on a lot of teams. She can score offensively, a really good shooter, as we've seen throughout her time in the international stage, but still not necessarily kind of going to be rivaling some of the higher end players like Canada's team or the most skilled players on the Czechs and that sort of idea. And then there's one other player who's been on the PWHL before with Akane Shiga from Japan, a bit more of that kind of workhorse type forward that can log a lot of minutes. We've seen her obviously on the big stage of course, in the IIHF, but also in the PWHL. She'll be a huge addition if she does eventually come back overseas, a player that plays with a lot of pace, a very fast player, but needs someone to kind of put the puck in the back of the net on her line. I think that's where you can really see her addition to any one of these PWHL teams be a huge factor, and especially for teams who are looking to go down a playoff run or try and earn the higher draft spot after they've been eliminated, definitely a huge opportunity for them there. But those are just some of the players that very well could go over. You look at the PWHL, has a huge impact and has had a huge impact on the women's game so far. We've seen Canada at the most recent Olympic Games walk in with a full PWHL roster. We've seen the Czechs kind of have a few of their top players over in the PWHL as well. Their growth has been tremendous. You can expect that to continue throughout the next few years as they try and shape into be a team that is going to consistently knock on the door of teams like Canada and the US. And I think they are just about there. You look around, kind of the rebuild that's going to have to go on in Canada. There's the potential for that Canadian replacement to come in. Yes, the US is relatively young. They have a few established players out in the PWHL. But in the end, you look for that next team up, and whether it be the Swedes, obviously the Swedes have been a team that have been knocking on the door for quite a few years as well, or whether it be the Czechs, the Finns are always good, the Swiss, we saw them at the most recent tournament get themselves back on track. And so definitely an opportunity there to kind of solidify themselves yet again at this tournament. Should definitely be interesting, to say the least there. Then, and also I'd be remiss not to talk about the U18 tournament, which has been one of the most competitive tournaments we've seen in quite a few years. You include the fact that now these players can go and play full-time, play hockey full-time as a job. Is a huge opportunity there to see both Czechia, Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, and also teams that might not necessarily have that opportunity, like Germany, who have a lot of young talent, just haven't quite made it over to that next level up. They're a team that I'd say as well you can throw into that mix as a potential upset type team. Lots of impact the PWHL has had and will continue to have as the years go onwards. Obviously, this is the first tournament with PWHL players in it. Yes, you can look down the line. There were PWHL players at that point, but not necessarily on the actual PWHL rosters yet with the introduction back in 2023. But still, PWHL impact continuing to have huge implications for these tournaments, and we'll continue to see what it can mean into the future, which then brings us on to our next point, and Italy is on the rise. And for Italy at these tournaments, yes, coming off the Olympic Games, a guaranteed spot into the Olympics, no one was really sure what to expect from them. And I'd say that both the women's side making the quarterfinals, which was a bit of a miracle in and of itself, and on the other side of the fact that on the men's side, they nearly beat Sweden, they nearly beat the Slovaks, they nearly beat the Swiss. And so yes, the game against Finland we're going to ignore for the purpose of this video because they are on the rise. And they've been on the rise the last few years. You can look kind of across the board at the most recent IIHF tournaments, and we date it back to 2025, not this year's tournaments, but the year before's, with Division 1B, where they end up being promoted at the Women's World Championships. So from April 12th or the 18th, they'll be competing in the Division 1A Women's World Championships for their chance to be promoted to the top spot. Coming off of some big wins, they beat France in that tournament. They don't need to beat France yet again. You look kind of across the board on the Women's World Championship side, a lot of potential there to kind of find their way through, and it'll be a very exciting tournament to watch. As for Italy, coming off the Olympic Games, it's always tough to kind of repeat what you did, especially on the big stage, but I do think that there is definitely a possibility there. For the Women's U18 tournament 2025, a second place finish at the Division 1A tournament. Unfortunately for them, a new crop of players comes in. They were relegated at this year's Division 1A program, Division 1A tournament, down to 6th place. We've demoted down to the Division 2 or Division 1B tournament rather, where they'll look to earn promotion next year's tournament. At the Men's World Championships, they will be in the top division this year after winning the Division 1A tournament last year. We'll see if they're going to be able to continue their success against some weaker type teams. And the beautiful part about what Italy did this year is that they didn't do what China did in 2022, where it was heritage versus naturalization. It was a huge debate. And I think in many ways for the Italians, the fact that they're going to get to retain a lot of their players is huge. And it's a huge opportunity for them to kind of continue their success into the big stage. And for a tournament as big as the Olympics were, to carry that forward into the Men's World Championship, where a lot of those same players are going to be back on the Men's World Championship side. You're not going to get a lot of those star-powered teams. And so there's a potential there to pull off yet another upset. And so for a team like Italy, a huge opportunity there to go out and try and pull off an upset against one of the bigger teams, stay up yet again for another year. And I think for a team like Italy, the potential is definitely there. And you look kind of at their competition, they're going to have a pretty good chance, I would say. And I don't want to say that they're guaranteed, because it's a long shot to be guaranteed. But if they can play the way that they did, if they can play with the same structure they did all tournament long, they're going to cause some problems for some of the weaker teams at this tournament. And it wouldn't surprise me to see them go out and end up staying alive for yet another year. Do I think they'll make the quarterfinals? I think that might be a little bit more of that long shot. But in the end, it's still a very high possibility that they stay up another year, get their players another year of development. Damian Clara, another goaltender for the Italians that we saw him at the Olympics. If he can play anything like he did there into the Men's World Championships against weaker talent, there's a huge opportunity there for the Italians to end up going far into that tournament. Definitely something to keep an eye on as May does roll around. Then we go to the other side of the men's with the World Juniors. And so for the World Juniors, very similar to the U18s, new crop of players playing the Division 1B tournament, ends up in third spot in 2025, which keeps them up another year in that tournament. Then we go to the 2026 tournament, Division 1B, where they were relegated, a sixth place finish this year at that tournament. A bit more of that disappointing type factor, I would say. And yes, you end up getting relegated both the women's U18 tournament and the men's World Juniors. And so a bit more of that concern where, yes, you're still kind of overextended, but in the end, still a relegation factor. They'll play in the Division 2A tournament next year, so a bit of a disappointing factor for them, but still a big win, a couple big wins in there at the Olympic Games, that kind of emotional wins in the Olympic Games that I'd say more than anything else were what they were looking for. Then to the men's U18 tournament, where of course they did earn promotion in that one in 2025. We'll see them at the Division 1B level from April 25th to May the 1st. And so a huge opportunity there for them to continue their success down the line. And so we'll see if they're going to be able to do that. See the men's U18 tournament. New batch of players every year. I think they'll be somewhat competitive, but I do think that we are starting to see that new crop of players kind of phase out. And so we'll see whether they're going to be able to find their way back in these tournaments, especially at the lower division tournaments. For the underage tournaments, the U20s, the U18s, we tend to see a little bit of a tough carryover. I expect that to continue here for the Italian team, but still, time will tell to see whether or not they are going to be able to find their way out. Division 1B, they're definitely a team that can contend in that division, but it is tough, especially year over year, whether or not they are going to have that same batch of players. We'll see for Italy if they're going to be able to do that at the men's U18s from April 25th to May the 1st. And then we can talk a little bit about the Olympics, and talked a little bit about it already, but for the Italians, a huge win. And not just the fact that maybe you look at the wins and say, well, they didn't win anything on the men's side, they lost all their games, but emotional wins are huge, and especially on home ice. We've seen it time after time, and we've seen it, of course, with the Women's World Championships back in 2025, last year, in České Budějovice, Czechia. That win does kind of extends far beyond the fact that they lost a medal. And it's not the fact that they won, it's not the fact that they lost. It's the fact that they gave a lot of players hope to grow forward so that, 10 years down the line, 20 years down the line into the future, they can look back on this tournament and say, yeah, I was there when this happened, when that happened, and you grow a lot of fans through the game that way. It's a huge opportunity for the Italian team to continue their success down the line into the future and grow that new crop of players who might not have ever heard of hockey and now all of a sudden have that next chance up. Very excited to see what Italy can do down the line, especially at the upcoming Men's World Championships, We'll see them in that top division. On the women's side, we'll see if they can earn their promotion to the top group. Very excited to see that. It should be a very, very entertaining game, to say the least, between them and France in that rematch. Super excited to see that. And so we'll see, of course, whether or not Italy is going to be able to find their way back up to the top divisions. Obviously, some big tournaments coming up for them, but it should be exciting, to say the least, to see whether or not they're going to be able to pull off a huge upset at the upcoming Men's World Championships from May 15th to May 31st. A reminder that we will be having full coverage on our YouTube channel for that. Be sure to come back. Lots to talk about in those games. Should be exciting, to say the least. Then we go to topic number 6. We'll start here with the IIHF and fighting. Two words that don't necessarily go together, but after the most recent Olympic Games, I'd say that there is a bit of a contention point there that maybe, just maybe, we might see the fighting come back to the IIHF. And yes, I know most people, including myself, say, well, the IIHF should be separate from NHL North American leagues, but you look at the fact for fighting, and sometimes you need it. And I'd say that players take runs. It's one of the beautiful parts, really, about about hockey in general, is that you settle it on the ice. And I think that's one of the things that, for the IIHF, yes, you're trying to protect players. Yes, players are technically volunteers. And so there's a bit more of that aspect that you have to consider when you are taking a look at, well, should the IIHF kind of neutralize that, or should they continue to kind of set forth with what they have? There is the factor of, well, they want to protect players. But after this tournament, the better argument is, well, what are the IIHF officiating? What is it going to look like in 5-10 years? And yes, right now, a relatively more protected league, the last few years, has been a very high emphasis on head contact and reducing the amount of head contact in the games. And so we'll see whether or not that's going to be able to continue throughout the rest of this tournament, or the rest of these tournaments, because there is the potential for it. And if they include fighting, you allow the fact that, yes, and you settle it on the ice, you take less penalties because of that. There's less big hits that I'd say arise because of the fact that you allow fighting. Players understand that if they're going to hit somebody, they got to answer the bell as well. But in the same context, then you look at the women's side and say, well, if you're going to allow fighting on the men's side, does the women's side get it too? Because, of course, we've seen that in the PWHL, where you're not necessarily dropping your gloves because of the cages and the fish bowls. But do you allow them just to go, glove on glove and let them duke it out? And I think it's definitely an argument to be made that for a game like, or a sport like hockey, that is what kind of separates hockey from other sports like soccer, where it's a bit more of that kind of softer type side of the game. And baseball, I'd say as well, you have brawls every so often, but not necessarily allowed to do it. Where hockey, you make an error or you hit someone too hard, you're going to have to answer the bell. I think it is definitely something that IIHF, and I can appreciate also as a North American fan that me saying that, considering I watch the NHL and kind of you get access to the NHL, the AHL, which fighting, and the OHL, which is fighting's encouraged. It's a little bit different for the IIHF, which is more so on the European side, protecting players as well as a huge part for them. Definitely something to keep an eye on. I mean, yes, probably not going to change. And I think to the Olympics, we saw Creenall go up against Wilson. Two players dropped the gloves, realized that they couldn't actually fight, and then kind of hug it out because they realized that, well, can't go back now. And so I think as much as, yes, Olympics a little bit different, NHL officiating as well. So the rule book was a little bit different. I do think that if you shift that to a world championship, a very different result for sure. But the IIHF for fighting, two words that don't necessarily go together, but we will see if in the future there might be a possibility there. Then we will shift to the global rankings. And so for the global rankings, a few things that I want to touch on, and one that I'd say in many ways has been one of the most competitive last few years I think we've ever seen on the international side. And of course, you also can include Russia in there, who hasn't been a part of these tournaments. When they are eventually added back in, there does exist the potential for yet another kind of competitive team into this mix that we haven't seen before. And so we look at the global rankings as far as the women's side go. You have the U.S. and Canada kind of that 1 and 2, and even the 1 and 2, I'd say, has been threatened over the last few years. Think to the Czech game where the Czechs went 2-1 against the U.S. in the semis at last year's Women's World Championships. Very tight there for Canada, coming 2-1, almost losing to the Swiss in the semifinals at the most recent Olympic Games. Two teams who are basically fighting for their chances right now. And so there's a bit of a kind of contention point there, I would say, for the USA and Canada is, yes, they are still considered the best teams in the world on the women's side, but I'm not sure how much longer we're going to see that, especially for the Canadians who are about to go through a pretty big rebuild for their national program. Should be interesting to see kind of who ends up sticking, who ends up going from there, and how much different that team is going to look like come November. Then you can keep going down the list. Of course, the Czechs, the Finns, the Swiss, and the Swedes, those four teams have all basically beaten each other in some context. And, the Swedes this year, probably one of the bigger surprises, I'd say, ended up making it on to, ends up losing to the Swiss in the Olympic bronze medal game. But really, they've been a team that have been on the rise these last few years. And unfortunately, just kind of gotten on the butt end of the fact that the staggered groups in the Women's World Championships, where all the best 5 teams are in Group A, the next 5 are in Group B, and the top Group B team ends up playing that 3rd seed Group A team, which tends to either be the Czechs or the Finns, 2 of the better teams in Group A. Unfortunately for the Swedes, haven't been able to get themselves up into that top group, in that Group A spot. Luckily, with the Women's World Championships in November, going back to the staggered format with the 1 in Group A, 2-3 in Group B, 4-5 in Group A, 5-6 or 6-7, you keep going down the list there. You get back to the part about, you look at about the Women's Worlds, and now all of a sudden you encourage that competitive factor where teams like Sweden, teams like Switzerland, teams like the Czechs, teams like the Finns will get to play Canada and the US and don't necessarily have to go through them to end up getting to that spot. So all you need is one big win, and then all of a sudden you can very well shift the tide. And so there's the potential there for better competition, more exciting action, I'd say, with the groups going back to the staggered for that kind of broken apart format. So I'm very excited, to say the least, about how far that's going to go, but should be interesting to see there. Of course, the Czechs, the Finns, 2 teams that have been battling it out in the Group A for the last few years. Unfortunately for the Finns this year at the Olympics, also lost out to the Swiss. The Swedes beat the Czechs. The Czechs and the Finns have beaten the Swiss and the Swedes at last year's Women's World Championship. So it's kind of that rotating sidewinder, if you will, of all the different teams kind of coming together now and saying, those 4 teams are about as competitive as you're going to get. Each one of those games are relatively coin flip games, and so we'll see moving forward whether or not that's going to be any kind of indication. Obviously, they are looking to try and go up against teams like Canada and the US, which I think that there is the potential for that, but definitely remains to be seen if Canada, Sweden, Switzerland, Czechia, and Finland end up coming back. Very excited, to say the least, because the Women's World Championships coming up in November, probably one of the most competitive Women's World Championships we will see since 2019, where of course the Finns on home ice nearly beat Canada, or they beat Canada, almost nearly beat the US. Something to definitely keep an eye on there. And then I'd be remiss not to talk about the other 3 teams who are kind of lower down in the women's rankings, but you look at Japan, you look at Germany, you look at Italy. All 3 of those teams, that's, of course, Japan beats Germany, Germany beats Japan at this year's Olympic Games, Japan beats Germany at the Women's World Championships. Italy ends up beating Japan, and so there's kind of that, once again, rotating type circle where it's they beat them, you beat them, Germany beats Italy, and it's part of that exciting process yet again where Italy should be up with the top group over the next few years. I'd be surprised not to see them there. I think you look at their team, definitely one that's been growing and is going to only get better, and so we'll see whether or not they're going to be able to continue their success. Definitely something to keep an eye on there, but for the Italians looking to grow, we talked about them in our 2 segments ago. Germany is a team that has been knocking on the door for quite a few years. They have the pieces in place, just not necessarily gotten that big result that they've been looking for. For Japan, it's been a few disappointing tournaments for them. Just haven't quite been able to get the right matchup to get themselves into that big game. Think to the last two Olympics, they're lost to China, they're lost to Italy at this Olympic Games. It's been a bit of a disappointing run for them at the Olympics, and especially at the Women's World Championships, where they were a Group A team not so long ago. It's been a tough sled for them back into the Group B side, who hasn't really enjoyed that success. But I do think that it is coming. It's only a matter of time before they really get there. That's kind of the women's side. As far as the global rankings go, definitely one of the most competitive we've seen in quite a few years. You look kind of, once again, USA and Canada 1-2. Have been beaten by the next group, right? With Switzerland nearly beating Canada, Czechia nearly beating the US. In the next group, you have the Czechs, the Finns, the Swiss, and the Swedes. All four of those teams have beaten each other at some point. Japan, Germany, and Italy kind of in that weird range as well, who've been very good, but also have provided some very entertaining games. Should be interesting to see moving forward whether or not the big two in Canada and the US will be knocked off. The Women's World Championships in November, I would say keep an eye out for, because the Czechs are a team that have been knocking on the door for quite a few years. The Swedes as well have been on the rise. The Finns as well, always a tough team to beat. I don't necessarily think that they'll be able to beat Canada or the US, but I think that they are still very capable of beating teams like the Czechs, beating teams like the Swedes, beating teams like the Swiss, especially with their roster composition. The Swiss, notorious upset leaders, Andrea Brandely, Saskia Maurer, two goaltenders that have the potential to change games, and especially with the format shifting back to the snake format, a huge opportunity on the women's side to continue to move forward into these tournaments. Then we go to the men's side of the game with, I'd say, yet again, another opportunity for probably one of the most competitive fields we've seen in quite a while. And you think to the number one, number two, yes, it's probably still the USA and Canada, but it's still an opportunity for them to, there's upsets around the corner. And for Canada, they haven't been on the podium at the World Championships in a little while. And you think to last year, losing to Denmark, and I'd say that one was probably one of the more embarrassing losses. The year before that, they lost the bronze medal game and played pretty poorly as well. But you think about it, right? And it's part of the argument to be made is for the USA, for Canada, they are two teams that I would say are kind of, I don't want to say that heavy favorite in any tournament they come into, but pretty close to that. And the US, I'd say, is slightly favored, especially coming off the Olympic win. Four nations as well. Canada ended up on top, so I guess you could say flip-flop for number one. Then you keep going down the list with the Swedes, who haven't necessarily had their best game over the last little while. Bronze medalists in 25, 24, and they've always been kind of close in the World Championships. A bit of a disappointing Olympic Games, losing to the Finns, and then beating the Slovaks by a goal short. A tough loss for them. Then to the Finns, they came third in the Olympic Games, probably one of their best accomplishments over the last little while. Keep going down the list with the Czechs, who won gold back in 2024 at the World Championships. Switzerland in 2025 and 2024 taking home the silver medal. And so for them, another pretty big accomplishment. You keep going down the list here. Germany taking home the silver medal back in 2023 at the World Championships. Latvia in 2023 as well, taking home the bronze medal at that tournament. And then you have Slovakia, who I would say has been one of those teams that have been on the rise, a very young team too, I might add, that just came fourth at the Olympic Games. They've had a few other really good performances over the years, have kind of come up one win short at a lot of these big tournaments. And so they beat the Finns, who ended up going on to win bronze. They lost to them, of course, in that bronze medal game. And so I think for the Slovaks, a lot of opportunity there. You also can look at a team like Denmark, who for the Danes, you look at their game and you kind of say, well, the Danes just beat Canada at the World Championships, so they should also earn a spot. And I think it all comes down to just how competitive this global game has become, and it's part of the great storylines and getting to cover it as part of my favorite part of it. is the fact that, well, most of the time, these games are going to end up being really competitive, tight games. Yes, there's the occasional blowout, and that's just kind of how hockey works, unfortunately, is sometimes you don't get those big saves from your goaltender, especially as an underdog type team. But you look at it for the U.S., for Canada, I don't remember the last time they were as threatened as they were, because Canada's been sitting pretty for the last number of years. You also include the fact that Russia can be in here as well, as far as the IIHF not having them in right now. This global game is just going to get more competitive as these years go onward. Canada has been losing the last number of World Juniors on the men's side. The U.S. had a good run back-to-back gold, of course, 24 and 25, and 26, of course, they lost to the Finns in the quarterfinals. But you look at it for the U.S., they have been threatened over the last few years. For Canada, they are being threatened right now. And so I think as much as, yes, you look at the Olympic Games and say, well, it ended up as we predicted. This game is getting more and more competitive by the day, and as much as Canada and the U.S. still sit pretty at number 1 and number 2, it is only a matter of time. And the other thing I will preface this with is the IIHF rankings have it different as far as like the world rankings go. The U.S. or Canada, one of them is number 1, and Switzerland's number 2 right now. So I'm not putting as much emphasis on what the IIHF says. I'm putting my own power rankings into this for the global ranking segment, but kind of continue down the list, right? The Finns, the Swedes, 2 teams that have been causing problems. The Finns nearly beat Canada at the Olympics. The Swedes nearly beat the U.S. at the Olympics. Czechia, and the Swedes also beat the U.S. at 4 Nations. I will remind you about that. The Czechs, winning gold back in 2024, beating a lot of the teams that they needed to get to that point. The Swiss, back-to-back silver medals. They've been knocking on the door. They will also host the World Championships this year coming up in May, which is a huge opportunity for them on home ice. That we've talked a little bit about how Italy did it, and of course the Czechs back for the Women's World Championships. Having home ice is a huge advantage, and we saw what happened with Denmark last year at the Men's World Championships, where they were able to knock off Canada. This might be the year for the Swiss. They will be without Kevin Fiala, who is out for the rest of the year. We'll see whether or not they're going to be able to rally behind their player and end up going far into this year's tournament. And of course, Germany, once again, we talked about it, silver medal in 23. They've been getting better and better as well. You include the fact that Leon Draisaitl hasn't been back at the World Championships. You put him into that position, all of a sudden it's a very, very different team than what we've seen over the last few World Championships. And so I think Latvia as well, you look at their World Juniors runs where they've upset Canada at the last 2. They didn't end up pulling through in the 2026 juniors, but in 2025 where they were able to beat them in the shootout. And so I think in many ways it's a bit of a tough sled to get to that top spot, but the opportunity is there, and that's one of the beautiful parts about the international game, especially on the hockey side now, is it is as competitive as ever, and it's only a matter of time before we see 1 and 2 replaced. We'll shift into now to live questions, and so we'll ask everyone in our chat, in our YouTube side, to please drop your questions down below into our live chat. While you're at it, please do hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. For those over on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please do hit the follow button and give us a 5-star rating. Helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. All right, let's see what we got here for our things. We have from Nick, the IIHF fan, who says, for the women's U18, Sweden beat the USA in 2023. Czechia knocked off Canada in 2024. And that's exactly right. And it's part of the beauty of it, right? And I'd say in many ways, you kind of look at it and say, well, if the U18 tournament is as competitive as it is, what's that to say that, the next tournament isn't? And I would also include that there is no Women's World Juniors yet. And I do hope that they eventually establish that, because it's a huge opportunity to grow the game. And I think in many ways, I'd be very excited for that tournament, because it's a potential to continue to grow the women's side of the game. And whatever time of period you put it in, whether it be you try and fit it into that kind of August range, I think it's a really good opportunity there. Obviously, with the Women's World Championships going November, it also opens up the possibility for them to put it in April. I think there's a lot of different ways you can kind of slot it in. Of course, the Women's U18 tournament's now currently in January. Should be interesting to see whether or not they are going to go through with that. From Alex Luke 7801, who says, is there an issue with the women's program in Finland, seeing how badly outclassed they looked at the U18 level? Very fair. And you look at their program, obviously the relegation at the most recent tournament, first time ever that a Finnish team has been relegated across all 5 of the major tournaments. So a huge loss for them kind of being in that spot. We looked at that Women's World Championships a few years back where they kind of struggled to get themselves back up into that big tournament spot. But I would say that in many ways, yes, there's a bit of an issue there. There's a bit of a concern there. But in the end, it's ultimately going to come down to, well, how well have they played at the Women's Worlds? And their team is still relatively young over in Finland. Yes, they have a few players that are going to age out, and as that's with any team, especially you look at the women's side, where they've always kind of ran on a 4-year cycle where they at some point will kind of cut their losses with their current team and end up shaping into their new younger type team. And so I think there is going to be a bit of a concern there, but the beautiful part about the Finns is, as much as, yes, their younger talent pool might not be as good as it can be, they do need to try and replenish it at some point. I think that their game has been a little bit shaky as of late. Yes, they have played some pretty good hockey. Yes, they end up just winning the bronze medal back in 2025 at the World Championships. But we've seen them continue to play kind of worse and worse as these tournaments have gone onward. Their team has not necessarily gotten better, especially since 2019, which was their all-time high, obviously coming second place at the Women's Worlds, nearly beating the U.S. because of a goaltender interference call. That was their opportunity, right? And so I think as much as, yes, there's a cause for concern with the lower division or the U18 level having some issues, at the same time, there is definitely some issues there. Which team do you think will make the highest division in the IIHF Worlds? As far as the Division 1A tournament will go, I would assume that is what that's asking about. It's a good question. I think every year presents some new opportunities, and it's always tough to say kind of early out here because like you kind of think there's 2 ways to look at it, right? Where the men's side is always competitive and you tend to see the same kind of teams that got relegated come back up. And so it wouldn't surprise me to see that be the case. I think every year there's a new opportunity to kind of come up and down. But as far as kind of who I think in the top division will go, I'm excited to see Italy this year. I think Italy's going to be a really, really good team that's going to end up finding their way back up. I think it's only a matter of time before they do. And I think they're going to stay up. And I think it's part of the beauty of coming off the Olympic year where we see the kind of structure and pace they're playing with. Obviously, coaching is a big deal, has a huge part to play in that. But the way that they played at the Olympic Games, they can play anything like they did there at the upcoming Men's World Championships. They have a legitimate chance to end up making that quarterfinal round. From there, probably not going very far, but if they can play with that structure, play with that chemistry, it's a huge addition for them. I think it's only a matter of time before they pull off one big major upset towards the end. Definitely something I'm keeping my eye on there. What else do we got? Teams like the Swiss and Czechs play with a very disciplined defensive structure. They need to find a way to push offense in their games versus the North Americans. Yeah, that's certainly fair, and I think it's part of the way too is as they catch up with pace, their structure kind of evolves. And we've seen that from the Swedes over the last however many years is they too were a team that was relatively defensive back in the day. And obviously they had their really good teams throughout. But like the Finns, they've had to evolve their game over the years as they become the better nations, the more skilled teams at these tournaments. And so it's part of the beautiful part of the international game and how much it changes is you have teams that replace them and you have teams that replace you as a defensive heavy team. And, teams like Latvia who really kind of play that suffocating defensive trap style who can accept the fact that they're going to be in their end for 50, 55 minutes a game, but they're going to get their one or two opportunities from it and go back the other way and try and score. It's a huge opportunity for them to really kind of push the pace back going the other way. And so for the Swiss and for the Czechs, them too, very similarly, where they have been a dominated team for the last however many years, they're slowly but surely starting to get the talent pool in place to end up going back the other way and finding those chances and really pushing the pace for me there. From Johnny, I'm sorry, fighting for me is a no-no unless it's a combat sport. That is fair too, and I think that's part of the difference in perspectives as well, I'd say, and part of it too is, as a North American fan, fighting's a part of the game here. And, the NHL, the AHL, and the junior leagues as well, all part of it is, it's all part of the game. And you take a 5-minute penalty for fighting, you sit your 5 minutes and you come back on the ice. And I think, and to Alex's point as well, where I don't think the IIHF have ever allowed fighting. Yes, there have been brawls in the past, but it was never allowed. And that's right too. And I think that's part of the argument to be made is, well, should it be? And I think that's part of the beauty of it is, well, you can say maybe it should be, maybe it shouldn't be. But I do think that in the end, the argument could definitely be there to make kind of say, well, there might just be a case to be made for a little bit of fighting in the game. Hope this Olympics have a bigger impact on hockey in Italy than the previous one in 2006. And that's fair. And I think part of it too is the performance of the Italian team has a huge part to play in the growth aspect of the game. And you look across the board and you can look at other tournaments as well, but especially for the Olympic Games with how big they are, and especially for the Italian team who played as well as they did, there's a lot of belief and there's a lot of hope right now. Now it's a matter of they can go and capitalize on that newly developed belief and hope. Very excited to see what they can do. I do think it's only really a matter of time before they kind of go there. If you look at football, soccer, you sometimes see fans get hyped up due to brawls, but then they know the repercussions for those. It's fun watching, but you know what's coming next. And that's fair too. And I think that's part of the argument as well, where, for fighting, if you allow it, right, you have to make sure that the penalty for it isn't one way or isn't one-sided, because otherwise it's whoever wins the fight ends up taking it. But I do think that in the end should be very interesting, to say the least, see if we will get fighting at any point inside the IIHF. But that's going to wrap it up today for episode number 2 of the On the Fly International Hockey Podcast. A huge thank you to everyone who hung out with us in the live chat today, and for those listening over on the audio version of the program. If you enjoyed the breakdown of lower division tournaments and the state of international hockey, be sure you've hit that subscribe button on YouTube and turn on notifications so you never miss a live stream. For our listeners on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. Don't forget to follow us at OnTheFly1515 on Instagram, X, and TikTok for highlight and news throughout the week. I'm your host, Parker McLean, and until next time, see ya.